Good evening, everyone, on this glorious, not quite summer's evening. The sun's come out for this special occasion. It's a huge pleasure for me to be able to be the chairman of ceremonies at this joint inaugural lecture for Gary Dymski and Jon Lovett. It's been an enormous pleasure for me to work with both of them since they joined the university, not so very long ago, although lots and lots of things have happened in the period since they joined us. And it's also an occasion to AIRE, the Applied Institute for Research in Economics at the University of Leeds. So the schedule is we're going to first of all hear from Gary, and then we're going to hear from Jon, and then at the end Kevin Reilly is going to talk to us a little bit about AIRE, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So we won't have questions and answers after the inaugurals. It's sort of tradition that you don't have questions and answers after inaugurals. Don't ask me why, but we're going to break the tradition today. We will have some questions at the end. First up then is Professor Gary Dymski, Professor of Applied Economics in the Leeds University Business School. Gary is researching on research and policy analysis on many applied topics, including, and I've just chosen one or two of the areas that you work in, Gary. So bank mergers, financial fragility and crisis, urban development, credit market discrimination, housing finance and subprime lending crisis, and the Eurozone crisis. So there's a sort of theme running through that, crisis. I wondered if you perhaps should be a chair in crisis management. But Gary is also Vice Chair of ACTS, which is a collaboration between Leeds universities and the third sector in Leeds, and has been very active in that for the last year, I think. And he's also now working on issues of financial exclusion, poverty and employment with Leeds City Council. So without further ado, Gary. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming out tonight. I will kind of let myself be guided by a script just so I don't exceed time. We've got lots to talk about and lots of speakers tonight, but thank you so much for coming. Jon suggested when we did this that we think about journey, the idea of a journey, and I thought that was a nice way to capture what we wanted to say. And my own journey toward economics started with the social and political challenges posed by my home city of Philadelphia, the city in which I grew up and in which I went to the university. It experienced race riots twice in the 1960s, widening divides of suspicion between working class residents that were divided by race but united in facing deindustrialization and fiscal stress. So I became an urban studies major at the University of Pennsylvania, and intrigued by the dynamics of uneven urban development and success and deprivation, often in close proximity. I got an MPA from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University and then plunged into work, first in Philadelphia. And here we see actually that's a almost exclusively black part of Philadelphia, and that's an almost exclusively white part of Philadelphia, neither neighborhood of which had anything like good education for its children. I worked first in Philly, then I moved to Indiana. There in Indiana, I was a economic analyst for a federal poverty law organization, and then became staff director and fiscal analyst for the Democratic caucus in the Indiana State Senate. Now, what I found in working with activists and organizations and with political leadership was that economics constituted the highest hurdle in finding new ways forward. What especially seized my attention was the problem of areas of access to credit for homeownership and small business in particular. Problems of redlining and discrimination pose barriers for equitable growth and contributed to the uneven urban development. Furthermore, it turned out that the government had a central role in these dynamics, and actually redlining is something that was a problem wherein people inside redline areas could not get fair access to credit. And what's notable is that this map actually was not taken from the inner bank vaults of let's say, Bank of America, but actually was drawn by the Home Ownership Loan Corporation of the federal government in 1934. In other words, we were looking at a policy that was certainly embellished by bad banking practices, but began with discriminatory policies of the government. And so essentially, you know, to understand this, to unwrap this nexus, I needed more training. That led me from Indiana to UMass Amherst, where I had a chance to be inspired by mentors, some of whom I knew only from their works. Here's two names that will be familiar to most of you, and then some mentors from whom I learned personally. Now, what binds all of these people is all of these mentors, these four, is that they all take a macro perspective. And even when they engage in analyzing micro markets, I learned to think flexibly then, because for me, ideas like asymmetric information, principal agent theory, aggregate demand analysis, financial instability, exploitation, were ideas that I could see at the micro level as well as the macro. So I kind of got this dual map. It was then on to LA, and I've got a dramatic picture of LA. Some of you will know this from your memories and some maybe from the data banks. My first academic position was at USC, University of Southern California. That's the location on the upper left-hand side, which interestingly is right next to the neighborhood where all of that excitement happened in 1992. Actually, the late 80s and early 90s were an exciting time at USC for economic theory. Colleagues there were opening up new avenues of work in areas ranging from incomplete markets, chaos theory, agent-based modeling, sunspot models, etc. A key implication of this work was that incomplete market models in economics at a deep mathematical level have infinite solutions. You see this in the Folk theorem and other things in game theory. And so basically anything can be proven or disproven at a purely formal level. This changed the game once economists understood this, and these were the years when this was becoming clear. That is to say that the point was not to use tools to prove that only one thing is possible, but to tell the story that you want to tell. And so while never turning away from a fascination with theory, I moved increasingly toward applied work in applied political economy and economics. My most significant study there at USC was a citywide study that today of banking and inequality commissioned by the City Council of Los Angeles. Today it would be considered a big data project. It was a huge enterprise. We finished in 1991. The mayor of Los Angeles released the report, and then just months before the city burned in the well-known Los Angeles riots, our report was called Taking It to the Bank. For me, the riots and their aftermath, many meetings of academic researchers with concerned citizens, posed the question of how to design policies that would respond to problems that had spurred residents' anger. And this question is one posed then that remains relevant today as we see in the time of UKIP and the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. Now, next opened up a period of work in the 90s. I moved to UC Riverside and began to understand that these research questions I wanted to take up were all unfolding within the framework of the neoliberal era, and that there was actually a unity among things. As David mentioned, crises were on the agenda. And basically, I had looked at the Latin American crisis, and just as I was beginning a comparative study of the US, Japan, and Korea on housing finance so that we could learn from Korea's good example, actually at that moment, that's when the East Asian financial crisis broke out. And I actually saw that sign many times on the streets of Seoul in 1998. And I began to see the parallels between the urban problematic on the one hand and the problem of nation states' financial instability on the other. Micro and macro in my head could be understood as involving similar dynamics playing out at different spatial scales, always in bounded spaces with disequilibrium flows across the space's borders. Another band of attention to banking strategy, in particular mergers, and a problem that seizes me to today is to understand the implications of banks' increasing size and scale and the implications of lessened financial regulation for the financial system's performance of its essential economic functions. And so this is something, a problem of dysfunctional finance leading in some cases locally to payday lending that remains a challenge at the local, national, and global levels. This early emphasis on mortgage financing also led to the recognition early on of subprime lending, And I began then to work with geographers and sociologists, many of them in England actually, on this problem. That work has continued to this day. And just to say that it's been crucial, it's clear that it's crucial to use empirical evidence. However, gathering evidence and bringing it into debate in academics, what it shows us in part is that essentially these arguments are not resolved by logic alone. There's a political and a policy dimension that cannot be denied, and these considerations have to be taken into context. I bring you this picture up in the left. On the left of that picture is my partner from the years in Indiana Legal Services, Rod Bohannon, who's now president of the NAACP in Indiana. And next to him is a worker at the Ohio Center, run then by John Powell, who was Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights under the Carter administration, the Clinton administration. Okay, so basically, I then went to Sacramento, where for 7 years I was founder and had the chance to build the UC academic program for the system in the state capital of Sacramento. My tenure there coincided almost exactly with that of Governor Schwarzenegger, who you'll see featured in the middle of that other picture. In this partnership, we undertook many, many issues, and it really whetted my appetite for the idea of an even broader agenda. We took on issues from wildfires to education to finance to sustainable land use, et cetera, and really engage with the emerging policy issues of California. Now, also unfolding in those years was the subprime crisis. And in fact, that turned into the global financial crisis and led to many, many problems. When I returned to UC Riverside in 2010, that crisis was well along. And the prolonged California recession had both forced a downsizing of our center in Sacramento and had led to a shelving of the plans to dramatically expand the policy research agenda there. At the same time, in Southern Cal, I found a depressed economic landscape. Millions of California families had lost their homes, but the national policy debate had calcified. There really wasn't any action, and nor any serious engagement with the issues confronting the state. The economics department at USC, or at UC Riverside, like virtually all of those across the United States, kept a focus on narrow theoretical issues. And rather than taking on the profound unsolved challenges, the subprime crisis had morphed into a global crisis and global prosperity remained more tenuous than ever before. It was at this point that I got a call from Giuseppe Fontana, and he and the dean had a position that was available, and Giuseppe asked if I'd be interested in moving. Actually, I was. Under Malcolm Sawyer's leadership, the economics division had won a large EU grant to examine the implications of financialization for Europe, and there was a full complement of economists in the division here that were committed to applied research and using the tools of the discipline for making good in the world. So my final act at Riverside was actually to lead this workshop here, kind of calling attention to the crisis that really no political leadership was dealing with then, 2012, nor today, 2014. Now, just to move briefly, and in the final couple of minutes, to an engagement that was really very important for me as I have just been mentioning the U.S. I've had a chance to work in many different countries across the world, and just to say that of particular significance was a Keynesian conference in 1997 in Rio that led by a circuitous route to a meeting with a Brazilian professor in 2001, Silvano de Paula, and that, the rest, as they say, was history. So that was something that was quite fortuitous. The thing is, in Brazil, I was able to get increasingly involved with scholars and others and activists and residents and to explore some of the issues confronting the Brazilian economy. While many of my economist friends are working at the macro level, the problems are there at all levels, including the micro level, particularly in urban enclaves called favelas that are characterized by problems of inequality, poverty, and injustice. So one particular place that was important was the Complexo de Madé. And a key lesson from Brazil and elsewhere, anywhere on this planet, is that bottom-up voice is necessary to balance top-down policy design. The people most affected by the problem this world faces must play a role in doing something about these problems. This slide shows a community meeting in that same favela up there, Mare, and whose experiment in self-government is now threatened by a pre-World Cup occupation by the Brazilian army. It also shows down here the second of two workshops that I was able to co-organize on research about favelas in 2010 and 2011. So, coming to Leeds has opened a new chapter in my research and policy. The subprime crisis has led to the European crisis. Now with partners, especially Nina Kaltenbrunner, on a project on inequality in finance, I've been able to initiate a policy research program that is looking at some of the issues in Greece and the Euromemo group and other partners in the European Parliament and so on. And in whatever way possible, I want to do my part in helping to avert the onset of a global economic calamity that the world as we know it will not be able to survive. And in so doing, I am really energized by the opportunity to work toward this in a university community that's really embraced me and my wife Silvana, and letting us know that we have truly found our Yorkshire home. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Gary. So our next inaugural speaker is Professor Jon Lovett. So Jon is Chair of Global Challenges. He is researching on institutional economics of natural resource management in both urban and rural settings. His work takes him right across the natural sciences and social sciences. It's extremely broadly based, and I know that from working with him in WN meetings, where you see him talking to a very wide range of different people at the meetings. The work involves link between local and international law and policy and implementation of global agreements. And this work has taken him right across the world. He's worked in many countries, in Nepal, in Tanzania, and in Mexico, and I think many other countries in addition. So, Jon, please, your inaugural lecture. Thank you.
Good evening, and thanks very much for coming along. I started my research career in an African rainforest, and that's what this picture is. And I worked with the Worldwide Fund for Nature and Missouri Botanical Garden. And the work that I did there led to the area being declared as one of the world's top 25 biodiversity hotspots. And as a result, I was then asked to draw up management plans for the conservation of this globally important area of species richness and rarity. But after 10 years of living and working inside the forest, I then had to step outside the forest and place these extraordinary forests into their local human context. In my discussions with the people living next to the forest and the government officials charged with managing them, I discovered the importance of institutions. And this was my epiphany. The law was quite different inside and outside the forest reserves. If you were standing inside the forest reserves, then you were in British colonial law, a law dating back to the 1930s, where local people were alienated from access to what was called the natural fruits of the forest. If you stepped outside the forest, just over that narrow boundary of the forest reserve, you were in post-independent Ujamaa Maoist Tanzania. And it was the institutional arrangements that governed the way that people behaved in these different places. And that was my epiphany, and for the last 25 years I've been working on institutional economics, much influenced by the elegant Nobel Prize lecture of Douglas North, in which he describes institutions as the incentive structures of society, the underlying determinant of economic performance. After Africa, I spent a couple of years in Copenhagen and then joined the new Department of Environmental Economics at the University of York, where I was working with people like Charles Perrings, Ed Barbier and Jack Pezzi. And there I developed an international program on the institutional economics of natural resource management, investigating transaction costs, power, and institutional dynamics. Climate change was one of our central research foci, but eventually I wanted to do something that was a bit more directly engaged than dealing with the causes of climate change, rather than just looking at the impact that it was having on the natural environment. So I was then pleased to have another switch in career direction, and this time head up the Technology and Sustainable Development Group at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And instead of working with economists, I was now working with engineers on technology transfer. And this gave me the opportunity to apply institutional economics to new and challenging fields such as climate technology transfer in Ethiopia, gas energy policy in Indonesia, and electricity supply in Pakistan. So why is institutional economics important? Let's go back to Douglas North. He says that institutions are the humanly devised constraints that structure human interaction, and they're made of the formal constraints, informal constraints, and their enforcement characteristics. And together they define the incentive structure of societies, and specifically economies, institutions, and the technology employed that determine the transaction and transformation costs that add up to the costs of production. And my first application of institutional economics was to forest management. Community forest management was being widely implemented in the late 1980s and the 1990s as state-controlled forest departments handed over their management responsibilities to the people living in and around the forests. The aim was to improve equitable access to forest resources whilst enhancing ecological quality. And this was based on the assumption that closer linkages would create sustainability on standard Pareto principles of improving the gains and losses. We looked at the institutional arrangements and economics of community forests in Nepal, Mexico, and Tanzania, and by using an institutional lens, it was possible to reveal that even in the microcosm of wealth distribution in these remote rural communities, there was a lot of elite capture going on. By using transaction costs together with Bim Adhikari, we demonstrated that the poorest of the poor carried the greatest burden of the costs of community forest management, while the relatively richer members received the benefits. The next stage was to find a solution. And working together with Arturo Balderas Torres on the La Primavera Forest Reserve in Mexico, we used choice modelling to obtain estimates of willingness of the citizens of Guadalajara to pay for ecosystem services and the willingness of the community ejidos in the forests to accept payments. The analysis produced some interesting results. Firstly, there was a very strong yes in my backyard effect for ecosystem payments. People were willing to pay a lot more for local projects because of the co-benefits, which has important implications for global climatic change related forest policies, such as reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation that develop international carbon markets. Secondly, the ejidos didn't want money, they wanted community services. And Karina Aguilar from the La Primavera Management Office made contact with Manar, a group of Guadalajaran musicians who are one of the most popular Hispano-American bands, and they agreed to fund a community project to offset carbon emissions from their world tour. And this is the project that you see here in the photographs. And there's a picture of Karina, who's in Leeds with us at the moment on a Darwin Fellowship. The project's now been established and is attracting support and interest from the Mexican government because Manara are so famous in Mexico. They were able to go to Felipe Calderon and he immediately matched their funding. And they were also able to get a dialogue with entrepreneurs such as Carlos Slim, who is also funding the project. In 2008, when I was in Twente, I did some work for the Dutch government on market-based transfer of what the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change calls environmentally sound technologies, and interviewed industrial leaders attending the UNFCCC meeting in Poznan. The overwhelming message that I got from these industry leaders was that we have the technologies. What we need now is for governments to come to an agreement so that we have a level playing field for marketing those technologies. One leader talked about moving into a new ecological age for industry, where economy and technical innovation was driven by our ecological needs of balancing environmental inputs and outputs. Again, it's all about the institutions. It's about establishing an institutional matrix where eco-innovations capture their true values and subsidies for destructive practices are eliminated. Michael Porter, the Harvard business guru, talked about this some years ago with the idea that environmental regulations enhance competitiveness in innovation. This so-called Porter hypothesis is now recognized as a driver of green growth, and this is an area of research we're pursuing within AIRE through a series of events and grant applications. Living in an ecological age also means reconnecting with nature and reshaping markets to recognize those connections, as with the case of La Primavera in Guadalajara. Cities are not freestanding islands of human endeavor, but are set in a natural matrix. Recent climatic events in the UK show how droughts constrain the supply of natural resources and floods damage infrastructure. Resilience and adaptation start with the ecosystem approach, and the University of Leeds has been a leader in helping Natural England establish the South Pennine Ecosystem Approach pilot projects that have demonstrated positive economic returns from conservation investments. At the 2009 Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, the conference that was supposed to find an all-embracing institutional solution to the biophysical, economic and social problems associated with unsustainable anthropogenic utilizations of natural resources, I was struck by one of the concluding speakers using a quotation from Martin Luther King. "In the fierce urgency of now, there is such a thing as being too late." Copenhagen was branded by the environmental Munich of our times, but I think that assessment was wrong. Copenhagen was the beginning of global challenges being met by local solutions. In the Doha climate change meeting, a delegate described to me it as the balkanization of climate actions. If the international efforts don't succeed, then there is an urgency of now that we need to tackle the big problems locally. And institutional economics has enabled me to cross disciplines, from botany to social science and engineering and back. This type of interdisciplinary approach is what AIRE aims to do, to define the incentive structures of societies, to go from global challenges to local solutions, connecting disciplines, the city and the university. Thank you very much.
Since John and Gary joined Leeds, they've both worked together with many other people across the university, I think around 50 people across the university, to establish AIRE. And we're going to hear now a little bit about AIRE, because it's, I know that many of you here will have been involved, but take this opportunity to just talk a little bit about the aspirations of AIRE and what we're trying to achieve through AIRE. And so, very pleased that Kevin Reilly, who's the Director of Operations for AIRE. I should have said that John and Gary are respectively Deputy Director and Director of AIRE, and Kevin is the Director of Operations. So he's going to talk a little bit about, does all the work.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about.
Yeah. Let's do a little bit of work. Okay. This thing works. Does anything work here? Okay. Yeah. Basically, I want you to sort of think. This is a huge university. I've been here since 1995. And inside the economics division. Well, you think that the only people that are interested in economics would be inside the economics division. And the reality is, at a university like Leeds, there are economists all over the place. We know about the one, we found about 4 or 5 years ago, we discovered there were economists over in the Faculty of Medicine. And basically, we've just discovered people who were interested in economic problems, yet within a university with its siloed things, way of working, there is actually no way of communication. So the reality is, AIRE is really about bringing a space together for people to actually communicate about economic problems, to collaborate, and basically to actually get their, in a sense, research out there. And that's the fundamentals of AIRE. So basically, we're interested in establishing communication forms and dissemination of ideas. So what's that all about? Well, first, we want a working paper series. We want to develop a working paper series that is not only available to the people in the University of Leeds, but will actually engage outside. So in other words, the outside world can actually see what we're doing. The other thing is, the economists in medicine can turn around and say, oh, that's what the people in economics are, within the economics are doing, or similarly in geography, etc. And that's an important innovation that I certainly want to see. The other is get a seminar series together. Yeah, economics department has a seminar series, but what we're thinking of is a more wider one. Probably won't happen as often as the, say, the departmental seminar, but will bring together the community of economists across Leeds and outside guests. So we increase that. The other thing is, we got a website, and the person who's really responsible, I'll show you his mugshot later, it's not even me, is now up and live. So this is very embryonic. This just went live literally 3 hours ago. And so if you want a prettier picture, you got a better picture of the River Aire, we're happy, because that's where AIRE comes from. We basically put together the name, I think it was Stefan that came up with putting it together, AIRE, and he applied it to research in economics. So basically, this thing, you know, we got home. One thing I want to do here is now I got mug shots of the big poobahs. What I want is meet the directors, meet the economists. In other words, there's going to be a second tab there that people who are interested in economics research, little short biographies. I'll explain why that's going to be important. For example, Gary's been working with the Leeds City Council, so we're going to have things like the partnerships up there that engaged. Not only AIRE, but individuals within, okay? So the projects, we got Gary and Nina's thing. We're going to actually, I'm going to change that so it's a little more informative so that people can understand what the research people are doing. Because that's the critical part. If this website's going to be interesting and is going to have that communications factor, there's got to be the information there. And one thing, I actually put up one of my own papers. This is number 1, okay? But the point will be that I want this filled with all the economists or economic papers done at this university. And then I'm going to go to somebody like Professor Hogg and say, will you give me $1,000 American dollars so I can subscribe to the aggregator sites like the SSRN in the United States, which actually will get the research out to the world, okay? And as I know from my own experience, where do you get your citations? Where do you get your influence? It's actually at the working paper series. With publication lags, basically it's old news but by the time it appears in the journals. So I think that's, and we should actually get the mug up who is actually really responsible, Razim. So he's our coordinator, and he's done a lot of work in actually putting this all together. So the point is, this site's gonna basically evolve, especially over the next 3 months. It's gonna actually get to be a lot more informative. Okay. So, and basically the other thing is there are skills here. You know, I like playing on the supercomputer at this university and doing things like that. Other people have other skills. So by putting that information together, there will be a way of linking. It will no longer be a random event that, for example, Dave Spencer ended up hooking up with some people in environment and in engineering, but it was a purely random event that actually happened. And big research grants have come out of that. But the point is, what I see this as is a repository of individual academic skills, so that you want to put a research grant together, but you don't have a particular skill you need to make it a strong grant, this would be a place to go. And finally, we'll act as a sort of facilitator. As the calls come in, we'll sort of, in a sense, put out the push to see if there's people out there. So in that sense, just to sum up, AIRE is about facilitating research, not within the economics division, not within the business school, but across the university. Okay? And I think I'm done.
So, to invite questions now and just have a general discussion. So, Jon, Kevin, and Gary will stand at the front with me, and we'll just take questions on AIRE and the two inaugural lecturers, the making of the researcher. So, over to you.
You know, that's a good question. This question of impact is something that is increasingly posed for those of us in research. And actually, my experience in working in that center in Sacramento was that the policymakers appreciated us when we under-promised and over-delivered, and when we mostly listened. And so, in some sense, I think that we can have an impact by finding partners who need problems solved on the external to us. And those partners, in some cases, will be very specific. Behind you is Simon Brereton from the Leeds City Council. And Simon and I have sat down several times and talked about some of the problems and challenges that Leeds faces as a city region. There we can actually kind of dial in pretty precisely whether we're making a difference. There's this new survey being done, and some of our students are going to work on that and make some progress in understanding what that survey actually says from a statistical viewpoint. In other cases, for example, the work we're doing with the European Union and Eurozone, we enter in our voices to basically pretty much of a cacophony of contending views about the future of Europe, and we have to know that our ideas must be sound and soundly based, and to the extent that they're appreciated, that they're picked up, that will be, I guess, something we'll see in the policy process. I think more conventionally, the kind of thing that Kevin was showing, that is a working paper, in this case on something about the work process and satisfaction, we'll be able to see that that'll be picked up and appreciated by academics. So I think we'll be looking at the local, the national, international, and then the academic communities for our, I guess, satisfaction. But I have to say that I think that this question of impact is something that remains an unsolved puzzle for academics in this country generally.
Yeah. I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that if you want to progress within academia, you've got to go for these big interdisciplinary proposals. It's not that our work should be entirely driven by finances, but I have the PVC for Research standing here, and of course the number of successful grant applications that I get in as a leadership chair is obviously going to put me in good standing with VCAG. There's 20 billion euros worth of funding on the table from Horizon 2020 that's been released this year, and the vast majority of those proposals are engaged about interdisciplinary research that engages with the business community, with cities and end users for impact. And that's where we need to be as academics, is engaging with those very large interdisciplinary projects. In the School of Geography, for example, we've recently won the Big Data project, which is an interdisciplinary project together with with LUBS, and Fondi there is also part of that. And this is the kind of area that we need to be working in. And it's also well known that it's at the interfaces of disciplines that you actually get the innovation and the new thinking going on. So we need to be able to step back into basic principles, whether they're methodological or academic, in order to put together those kinds of proposals and projects where you're working with engineers, with economists, with medics, sociologists, or whoever, to face the grand challenges.
Yeah. Actually, I want to mention one thing that we should say about some of the stuff we're doing, which is just that in the first conversation I had with Pro-VC John Fisher of this university, he mentioned that one of the needs that he felt was for a kind of go-to place on the university, within the university, where colleagues needing economic analysis in order to successfully complete their work, and in many cases so as to achieve external funding, needed a place where they could go and just say, here's a problem we need solved. And actually, as we speak, Kevin and I have been working with something called the IKC, the Innovation Knowledge Center. It's one of the entities that's here on campus in the medical technology area. And so I think that in a sense, service branch function will be another part of our impact. It's just that we'll be there to support our colleagues when they need us. And the idea is, no questions asked, just bring your problem to us, and we'll go out in the yard and maybe smoke a cigarette or two and think it through.
In the yard only.
Next year we'll have the biennial European Society for Ecological Economics meeting in Leeds, which there's usually about 300, 400 people coming together for 4 days plus a PhD workshop. So that'll be an event that'll be running by AIRE. We're quite advanced on the planning for that. We're waiting for the International Society for Ecological Economics meeting in Iceland to finish before we launch it more officially. So that's one major European event that we'll be bringing to Leeds.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think it's fair to say that the University of Leeds is gaining a reputation globally for this kind of applied political economy, economics research. I think that first of all, we've got some links to communities of economists around the world. There's already been this year, I think, maybe as many as 7 or 8 visiting scholars, students that have come from different countries to join us here. So that's been kind of edifying. But in addition, just within the business school, and there's many there in geography joining John and so on, and others around the university, I think part of it is that these economists haven't found each other so much. I think also we try to embody this in the curriculum that we teach. And for example, one of the things we have now in the business school is a robust master's program that brings people from around the world to here. And the idea in some sense is to engage those students on some of the problems that are very real applied economic and political economy problems for them. I think the word spreads, and I think there'll be this kind of healthy exchange between students and established researchers in different fields. But I think that the meetings that Jon has mentioned will be just the beginning of what should be a kind of exciting global presence. I should note that Nina and I already had one meeting of our European project here in the university, and so I think that you'll start to see us kind of bringing in new and different kinds of people, and this should be exciting for everybody. We've got a business school that's on the rise, and lots of people. I think as we speak, the Confucius Institute has another event going, and it shows that there's a lot happening, and that's as it should be at a world-class place, and that's what we fully intend to do our part in contributing to.
I should just add another thing. I've been running a massive open online course on institutional economics, which had its first launch in October, and then we ran it again a couple of weeks ago. We had 5,500 participants from about 170 countries in the first run, and 3,500 internationally in the second run. So again, that's putting some of the institutional economics work from Leeds onto the global stage. And what I tried to do in the MOOC was to have research-led teaching. So instead of a textbook type of online course, it was very much trying to bring the participants directly into the research that we're doing. And hopefully, having trialed that one MOOC, then we can run some more.
There's a couple of answers to that. One is that, first, insofar as we interrelate with people around the university, I think that we'll be bringing those people together and insights together. I think beyond that, it's our individual interest as researchers, the three of us, but then the other economists around campus. The fact that most of the economists are in units like geography and environment engineering and so on really shows that people are engaged profoundly where they are. We recently, Paul Rutledge, a colleague from geography, and some others, we put together a proposal that has something to do with citizen participation and bottom-up activism and its role in urban change. Now, in some sense, I didn't participate in that so much as exclusively an economist, but as a person with some experience in working in those kind of organizations and able to bring some insights from the discipline. So I think in some cases, in some sense, we vote with our bodies to join interdisciplinary teams where everything will be melded, and I won't, or others won't necessarily have journal articles that will be within the narrow confines of the discipline, but that will instead be somehow important. And we have to trust each other and take chances. And I think part of allowing institutions like this to come to life is allowing this interdisciplinarity to breathe. We have a business model at the university that basically focuses on enrollments and make sure that the bodies are in the seats and that our bills can be paid. And in this era, this modern era, we've got to do that. That's for sure. But we can take limited chances, and I think it's incumbent on us who are in a position of having a chance to lead some things, to take some of these chances and to use that extra energy and experience to kind of get out there and make a safety net for some people to try some things out that they wouldn't otherwise have the chance. And I think that's part of the role that we can play. So that the people asking those questions and pulling together those meetings. For example, the project with Paul, we decided not to go forward at this point. We don't have the best chance for that particular external grant. But what we agreed, all of us, was that it very much makes sense for us to proceed and go forward as a group of people working across several different schools and faculties to continue to communicate, basically because we know that if we get our ideas together across these disciplinary lines, we will find a moment where we can both secure some resources to do some additional things, and meanwhile we'll strengthen our own collaboration and cooperation.
I'd also think that I don't view economics as a particularly narrow discipline. What I tried to get across was that it's the incentive structures that determine human behaviour, which of course pulls it very much into your own discipline as well. And I think if we go back more to this kind of classical view of economics rather than the neoclassical view of economics, then we can make a lot more progress in solving some of the difficult problems that confront us. And it also means that it opens the power of that approach to solve or to elucidate some of the issues that have been traditionally driven away from economics because of the very narrow association of economics with applied statistics rather than the incentive structures that determine human behaviour. And by having those broader things, then you can, as Gary said, you can bring it into the community work that Paul is doing. Or, for example, we have some people here from the co-housing areas looking at the transaction costs of how people interact, and what makes a successful co-housing project is something which is very important to a city like Leeds. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's 20 billion euros of Horizon 2020 money on the table at the moment. So partnering the university in some of the bids for European funding is very important, because Horizon 2020 requires academic institutions to be working in partnership. And of course, it also helps to define the research areas. We can have wonderful theoretical constructs in, let's say, institutional economics, but pressure testing them with the reality of what the city is facing, I think really helps to hone theory on the sharp edge of reality, and that's very important for academia, so that it gets the kite gets tugged down from the blue skies occasionally.
Yeah, I think Simon, I would probably add to that. I was just consulting with Kevin on this. I think we're on the same page that I think that we've got to get involved with you. We've got to come downtown and sit at a table and talk through with members of your working teams and the citizens that maybe are especially significant in your efforts about what the problems are, how we can help you see them maybe differently, and maybe make some progress together. We had an experiment where I got some of the master's students to think about some of the problems in Leeds, and I was really surprised and happy that 5 of the 3-person teams chose to work on poverty, employment, and growth in Leeds, and we had 1 team that chose to work on financial exclusion, and then we got you involved with them and had a happy day. That was just, though, a taste. I think that we can go beyond that. And I think that for the students, it's really exciting for them to know that their work matters. And I think we can think about better ways to make those interactions real. And something that I've talked a little bit with Vivian Jones, your colleague at the leadership level, about the idea of enhancing the student experience, generally speaking, at Leeds. The students these days want to be sure that they're getting something real for their tuition pound. And part of that is to have kind of reality-based experience as they can. It'll help them along, and they can begin to apply tools into real-world context. David Bell and I have talked a little bit, your head of school, about the idea of possibly an economics, geography, honors, 3rd year thing where some of the students might come and do internships and so on. So we're beginning to think now, because we're a university, these kinds of options that involve students will evolve slowly. I was actually slapped by my PG office for having played a little bit with the format of my course, my module, and introduced those group projects. But I did it because I knew it was the right thing to do. And I will now have to do proper diligence and get that project into the curriculum. And so it's advertised. So just to say that we move. But actually, I think not only bringing some people up, but for us to sit down, maybe for you to have a team of people that we could bring a team from here and just to brainstorm about what would be some of the ways that we can build together. It's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's because I started off as a botanist who then had to move into economics because I needed to make a difference. I found myself around the table with governments and ministers from a range of different countries saying, okay, what are you going to do from a practical perspective? And I just didn't have the language to connect with them or the techniques, so I had a very steep learning curve of how to do it. And the way I did that was really just going back to basic principles and trying to see what the core was, the disciplinary cores were in the different subjects in order to be able to then build up again. And I found that a very interesting process that kind of led me back into classical Greek thinkers like Aristotle and virtue ethics and so on. And just last week I presented a paper on different types of values to natural England, where I was using Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas to explain what was going wrong with economics in ecosystem services. So I think from an academic perspective, pulling yourself back into those core principles is quite important, and that is something important that we can learn from interdisciplinary research.
Yeah, let me actually, George, you provoke an interesting note. Mm-hmm. It is interesting that there is no chapter of the what are they called? Reality-based economics here at Leeds. Now, that's either because our students are indifferent, which I doubt, or that we're getting it right. And actually, if you the
revolt at Manchester.
Yeah, it's not the thing. And I think actually the word we like to use is pluralist here for our division. And I think the word for our institute is applied, and then the I could be interdisciplinary or institute. Now, as you say, that's conventional to work across disciplinary lines, but I think it is not conventional for economists. When I described the 1980s period in which I entered USC, and I think, Kevin, you remember, it was exciting. We had, like in macro, we had like OLG, and we had real business cycle and rational expectations and Keynesian. There was a kind of a whole potpourri of chaotic models and complexity models, lots of stuff, and it was kind of the idea that there was a lot of, there were heterogeneous tools that could be used to attack problems from different angles. And I think what's happened for some of some corners of the profession is that macroeconomics, for example, has turned into a war of position by people who are defending a very particular homogeneous model, this dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, in which, for example, money doesn't exist and it's always equilibrium all the time, and you can't even think of crises. What is healthy about us is that we don't judge each other methodologically, and we're open to different ideas. And so this acceptance of pluralism and multiple voices here, which seems natural, and I think is maybe natural for other social sciences, actually is very special in economics. And I think that's why you see the students registering their complaints elsewhere. And of course they're free to register the complaints here too. And people know that, like I teach a course in which I teach some very conventional tools of econometrics, but the students here will know that I teach them critically, but I teach them. These tools can give us so much, but not more. And that's generally true for all the tools that we economists have. They have their place, and they can add something to what we understand, and then sometimes even help us clarify exactly how much we don't understand. But to that extent, how many times have you been in a room where an economist has come in with the solution and shut down discussion from other social scientists or policymakers and said, no, we have to do this? And I think that's the kind of approach that's based on the idea that there's one model that can, you might say, rule them all, and one model that's right with everyone else wrong, that basically has given economics this reputation for being, that discipline that marches headfirst into the tar pits without even looking back. Here we're really doing it differently, and there's in part thinking of Dean Moiser's question. I think that you don't know when what you're going to do is going to be recognized. Effie's working on ecosystem services and innovations, and that's a really exciting idea, and John joins her in that. And it's the kind of thing where I could imagine becoming globally known and popular. We don't know. We just saw Thomas Piketty, whose work that we've all known for years on inequality and the 1%, suddenly become a global phenomenon. And I think in some sense what we have to do is to basically, work in our fields, work together with you and with others, make the progress we can make. Again, I like the model of under-promising and out-delivering. And in particular, while it is maybe conventional for all other social sciences to work together, what's special here is that 2/3 of the economists on this campus have to work with other disciplines day by day. And that leads to an orientation that's different. The people in ITS and health services and the other fields are used to the idea that they have to listen to other voices. And most economists around the planet that are in academic settings don't get that. That gives us a chance to be maybe especially sensitive to the need for change as we move forward. So, thank you. And David?
Thank you very much, Gary. So, kind of join me in a round of applause for our two excellent inaugural lecturers, and also for Kevin for his piece at the end on there. So, thank you very much to you all.